In the final weeks of 1944, as Patton's Third Army pushed through Alsace toward the German border, the soldiers of the advance units began encountering things that no military training had prepared them for. They had been trained for combat. They had been trained for the logistics of moving an army across a continent. They had been trained for the particular challenges of fighting in winter conditions in difficult terrain. They had not been trained for what they found when they moved through the villages and forests of Alsace and began to understand what had been happening in this region while it was under German occupation. The village of Alsace had been a small place before the war, the kind of village that exists in thousands across rural France, built around a church and a square, with a population that had farmed the same land for generations and that had the particular rootedness of communities that have not moved in centuries. By the time Patton's soldiers reached it in the winter of 1944, it was not a village anymore. It was a collection of burned walls and collapsed roofs, and the particular silence of a place where something has happened that the landscape itself seems to be unable to recover from. The soldiers who first entered what remained of Alsace found survivors. Not many, but some. People who had hidden in cellars and forests and who emerged when they heard American voices and American engines. People who had been waiting for months in the particular suspended state of those who have witnessed catastrophe and survived it, and who are not yet certain what surviving it means or what comes next. These survivors told the soldiers what had happened, and the soldiers reported it up the chain of command, and the report eventually reached Patton. What the survivors described had happened in the summer of 1944, in the weeks following the Allied landings in Normandy, when the German occupation forces in Alsace had been conducting what they called security operations in response to the increasing activity of the French resistance in the region. The SS unit responsible for the area had received intelligence, accurate or not, that the village had been providing support to resistance fighters. The commander of the unit, an SS Oberfuhrer named Heinrich Brenner, had made a decision that was consistent with the doctrine his unit had been trained to apply, and that was, by the standards of the Eastern Front, where many of these men had previously served, not considered extraordinary. He had assembled his unit and moved to the village in the early morning. He had ordered the population gathered in the square. He had separated the men from the women and children. The men, approximately 80 of them, ranging from boys of 16 to men in their 70s, had been taken to the edge of the village and shot. The women and children had been locked in the church. The church had been set on fire. Those who tried to escape through the windows had been shot. The village had then been burned systematically, building by building, until nothing remained that could shelter a resistance fighter or provide a base for continued operations. The survivors were people who had not been in the village that morning. A farmer who had been in his fields at dawn and had seen the smoke and hidden rather than returned. A woman who had been visiting relatives in a neighboring village and had returned to find what remained. A boy of 14 who had been sent on an errand the night before and who had hidden in a ditch when he heard the shooting, and who had stayed in that ditch for hours until the sound stopped. They had been living with what they knew since the summer. They had told no one because there was no one to tell. The German occupation authorities were not interested in their account. The neighboring villages knew what had happened and were silent, with the particular silence of communities that have been shown what happens to communities that are not silent. And so the knowledge of what had been done at Alsace had existed in a small circle of survivors and witnesses, unrecorded and unacknowledged, until the soldiers of Patton's Third Army arrived, and the survivors finally had someone to tell it to. Patton drove to Alsace himself. His staff had learned by this point in the campaign that when reports of this kind came in, Patton would go and see for himself, and that there was no point in suggesting that his time was better spent elsewhere. He arrived in the village in the morning in his staff car with his aide and a small security detail, and he walked through what remained of it, with the survivors as his guides. He was quiet for most of the walk. The officers who accompanied him had seen Patton in many situations, and they knew his silences as well as they knew his speeches. And the silence he maintained, walking through the burned ruins of Alsace, was a specific kind of silence that none of them had seen from him before. It was not the silence of a man suppressing anger, which was a silence they recognized. It was the silence of a man absorbing something that required the full capacity of his attention to absorb, something that was changing his understanding of what this war was and what it had been from the beginning. He stopped at the church. The walls were still standing, but the roof had collapsed inward, and the interior was a ruin of burned timber and ash. The survivors told him through an interpreter what had happened inside the church. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. When they finished, he stood for a moment looking at the church, and then he said something quietly that his aide wrote down and that appears in the records of the Third Army from this period. He said that he had believed he understood what they were fighting against. He said that he had been wrong about the extent of his understanding. He said that what had been done in this village was not a military act and had never been intended as a military act. It was something else, something that did not have a name in the military vocabulary he had spent his life building, and the absence of a name for it was itself a kind of information about how far outside the boundaries of anything he had been trained to think about it actually was. Then he asked for the name of the commander responsible. The survivors gave him what they knew: the SS unit designation, the physical description of the officer who had given the orders, the name that some of them had heard used, Brenner, though none of them could be certain of the spelling or whether it was a first name or a last name or a name at all rather than something else. Patton gave instructions to his intelligence staff. He told them that finding the commander responsible for Alsace was now an intelligence priority. He told them that he wanted everything that could be found about the unit, its movements since the summer, its current location, and the identity and current location of its commanding officer. He told them that he was not interested in this information for purposes of military prosecution, which was a process that would happen through proper channels after the war, but that he was interested in it because understanding what had been done and who had done it and how it had been possible was information that the Army needed to have in order to understand what it was actually fighting. He also said something else. He said that every soldier in the Third Army needed to understand that what had happened in Alsace was not an aberration. It was not the act of one criminal unit that had gone beyond what its commanders intended or sanctioned. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had been built to produce exactly this kind of outcome, and that the soldiers who were fighting that system needed to understand what they were fighting with complete clarity, without euphemism and without the comfortable distance of not knowing the specific details of what the system actually did when it operated as designed. He said that he was going to ensure that the soldiers of the Third Army knew about Alsace, not as a propaganda exercise, not to produce rage that would make them fight harder, though it would produce rage and they would fight harder, but because soldiers who understood what they were fighting against fought differently than soldiers who were operating on abstractions. And the men who had died in the fields outside this village, and the women and children who had died in this church, deserved to be known by the men whose job it was to make sure that the people who had killed them were defeated. The intelligence work that followed Patton's visit to Alsace produced results within weeks. The unit was identified, its movements were tracked, and in the advancing chaos of the German retreat through Alsace in the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the unit and its commander found themselves in the path of the Third Army's advance. Brenner was captured in February 1945. He was brought to a Third Army interrogation facility, and he was questioned by American intelligence officers in the presence of a JAG officer whose job was to ensure that the interrogation produced information that could be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Patton was not present at the interrogation. He had a war to run, and the interrogation of prisoners, even prisoners of this significance, was not something that required his personal presence. But he received the report of the interrogation, and the report was detailed, and what it contained was a precise and clinical account of a man who had done what he had done, and who, in the context of a formal military interrogation conducted by the army that had defeated him, was providing information in the calculated way of a man who believed that cooperation might produce better outcomes for himself than resistance. Brenner did not deny what had happened at Alsace. He described it in the language of military necessity, using the terminology of the security doctrine he had been trained in, referring to the population as having provided material support to illegal combatants, and to his actions as having been within the scope of his orders and consistent with the operational requirements of his command. He was precise and unemotional, and he described the deaths of the men in the fields and the women and children in the church with the same tone he used to describe the logistics of the operation. When the report of this interrogation reached Patton, he read it completely. Then he wrote a response to his intelligence staff that was also preserved in the Third Army records. He said that the interrogation report confirmed everything that needed to be confirmed for legal purposes, and that the material should be preserved and transmitted to the appropriate authorities for post-war prosecution. He said that Brenner should be held in secure custody and treated according to the Geneva Convention, because the United States Army applied the Geneva Convention to prisoners regardless of what those prisoners had done, and that the application of the Geneva Convention to a man like Brenner was not a courtesy extended to him personally, but a standard maintained by the Army for its own reasons that had nothing to do with whether the prisoner deserved it. Then he wrote something else. He wrote that he had read Brenner's description of the events at Alsace, and that the clinical precision of the description was in some ways more disturbing than rage or remorse would have been, because it revealed something about the nature of the system that had produced Brenner that simple criminal violence would not have revealed. He wrote that Brenner was not a man who had lost control or acted outside his training. He was a man who had acted exactly within his training, who had done precisely what the system he served had built him to do, and that this was the thing that needed to be understood about the enemy. Not that it produced monsters who acted outside human norms, but that it produced men who had been systematically trained to treat the actions at Alsace as normal military operations. He wrote that this was what they were fighting, not individual evil, though individual evil was present in abundance, but a system that had industrialized evil, that had built the structures and the training and the doctrine to make Alsace not an exception, but a standard operating procedure, and that the defeat of that system was the thing that the war was actually about, the thing beneath all the strategy and logistics and operational planning, the reason that all of it mattered. He wrote that he hoped the men who would handle the post-war accounting understood this. He wrote that punishment of individual perpetrators was necessary and right, but that it was not sufficient, that what was required was an accounting that reached the system itself, the doctrine and the training and the command structures that had made Alsace possible, and that if the post-war processes did not reach that level, they would have failed to do the thing that actually needed to be done. He wrote that he was not optimistic that they would reach that level, because the processes being designed were being designed by lawyers and diplomats and politicians who understood individual criminal responsibility very well, and who understood systemic accountability considerably less well, and that this gap between what was needed and what was likely to be delivered was something he found deeply troubling. The post-war trials at Nuremberg were, in the event, more sophisticated than Patton had feared. The concept of crimes against humanity, the prosecution of commanders for the acts of their units, the attempt to hold the system itself accountable through the prosecution of the men who had built and run it, these were genuine attempts to do the thing Patton had written about in his report. Whether they succeeded completely is a question that historians and legal scholars have been arguing about ever since. Brenner was tried after the war. The evidence from the Third Army interrogation was part of the case. He was convicted. The sentence was commensurate with what had been done at Marsa's, which is to say, it was a sentence that could never be fully commensurate with what had been done at Marsa's, because nothing that a court could impose could be fully commensurate with what had been done at Marsa's. But it was what the law could produce, and it was produced. Patton did not live to see the trials. He died in December 1945, 7 months before the Nuremberg verdicts were delivered. He had written what he thought needed to be written, and said what he thought needed to be said, and the processes he had fed with evidence and testimony went forward without him. The village of Marsa's was rebuilt after the war. The church was reconstructed. A memorial was placed at the site where the men had been shot, and another inside the rebuilt church for the women and children. The memorial carries the names of everyone who died there in the summer of 1944. 83 names carved in stone in a village in Alsace that most people have never heard of, and that the soldiers of Patton's Third Army found in the winter of 1944 as a collection of burned walls and collapsed roofs in the particular silence of a place that had been shown what the system they were fighting actually did when it operated as designed. Patton had walked through that silence and had understood something that changed his understanding of the war. He had written it down in a report that was preserved in the Third Army records. He had said that the soldiers needed to know, and in the winter and spring of 1945, as the Third Army pushed east, and the full scale of what the system had produced became visible, not just in burned villages, but in the camps and the mass graves and the documentation of industrial murder that the advancing armies uncovered across Germany, the soldiers knew. They knew exactly what they had been fighting, and they finished the job. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. See you in the next video.